I told you guys all a little bit about the new framework that Microsoft's delivering with the MVC4 drop, the ASP.NET Web API. I told you a bit about what the framework is, some of the features it gives us, and the most important question of why they decided to do it in the first place. And the answer to that, of course, is they wanted to make the process of developing HTTP services or REST-based services as frictionless as they can, and with WCF, some of the legacy that comes with it makes that experience heavy. So I'd like to continue that conversation today by giving you guys a brief demo. In this demonstration, I'll walk through the process of creating a very simple HTTP service. We'll look at some of the differences between traditional MVC and the ASP.NET Web API. We'll look at how to call the service using an HTTP debugger, and we'll even look briefly at some of the content negotiation capabilities of the framework. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. As with anything in .NET and Visual Studio, before we can do anything, we need a project. So to create a Web API project, just as simple as you can get: File, New, Project. And we have this, with MVC4, we have an MVC4 web application template. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And we'll call it test 1, 2, 3. When I hit OK, Visual Studio is going to prompt me with the type of MVC application I want. With MVC4, we got a few new project templates. One of them, of course, is our Web API. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Visual Studio is now going to go out to NuGet, grab all the necessary references, generate our code files. And one interesting thing to note about this particular project template is not only does it give us a simple harness for a Web API service, it gives us a fully functional MVC web application. It looks like the project's ready. Anybody here familiar with traditional MVC will notice that the project's very, very similar. We have a views folder, we have a models folder, currently empty, and our controllers. Since this is built on MVC, it should be no surprise that it's quite similar. If we open up the controllers directories here, the project template generated two different controllers. The home controller, which is just a traditional standard MVC controller. It derives from the controller base class, and it has a simple index action that returns a view. The more interesting of the two is the values controller. A couple things to note right off the top here is that this derives from a new base class that was delivered with MVC4 called API controller. This controller is the base class that all of our Web API services will derive from, and it gives us the basic things we need to deal with HTTP. It gives us access to the request context, access to the headers, and all that good stuff. So all of our services will derive from this class, or some type of that class. The other important thing to notice here is the names of the methods. We have a get, we have a post, we have a put. Anybody familiar with HTTP programming may note that these method names mimic the verbs that we can put on an HTTP request. And that's not a coincidence. In fact, it's a convention that this particular framework deals with. It also highlights one of the core differences between traditional MVC and the Web API. In traditional MVC, if you want the framework to send execution to a particular action, you have to supply in your URL 3 bits of information. You give it a controller name, the action name, and an optional ID. In the Web API, it's a little bit different. You supply it just the controller name and an optional ID. And the way that you drive execution to your methods is through a new convention on our HTTP request. So in order to drive execution to this method on our API controller, you would do an HTTP get to the values controller. If you wanted to go to the post action, you would do an HTTP post to the values controller. And I know that's a little bit strange, so to illustrate that, I will run this app here. And the first thing we're going to see is actually the index page for the MVC application that this project template gave us. Don't really care too much about that, but what I am going to do is steal this URL. I'm going to open up Fiddler, which is a fairly popular HTTP debugger. And if I can use Fiddler to actually compose HTTP requests. So what I'm going to do here is just copy this URL. I'm going to say /API values, and here's where I can select the verb that I want. These are all the HTTP verbs that you can put on the request. I'll select Git, and I'll hit execute, and as you can see, we were routed to our Git method on our HTTP controller. And here we're not doing a whole lot interesting. We're simply returning the numerable of strings. And if we look at that request, you can see that we actually got a JSON response of our values. Similarly, if I wanted to do an HTTP post, breakpoint here, I select the post action, and I can hit execute, and we route to our HTTP post method. So the idea here is that it uses the convention of HTTP verbs to route to specific actions on our controller. Now, since this is a different from traditional MVC, you may be wondering where these routes are set up. In MVC4, we have a route config file which sets up the routing conventions for the framework. Here's the more traditional route for standard controller-based MVC action. We have the controller, the action, the ID. And up here on top is the web API route configuration, where we just have a convention of API/controller and ID. Note the action is missing there, and that's because that action is actually derived from the verb that is put on the HTTP request. Alright, so let's make this particular example a little bit more interesting. The name values controller isn't real exciting, and it's the default that the project template gives you. It's actually a bit confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to orders controller. We'll let ReSharp handle the renaming here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a model. And we'll call it order. So here's our order model. And so here's our order class. We have a simple ID, a date, and an amount. So this represents an order. It could be anything. We go back to the orders controller now. I'm going to change the get method here to return an IEnumerable of order. And of course, since it's returning a list of orders, I need to actually return orders. So this is just me creating a real basic list of orders from this controller to return. If I rebuild this project, save the file, I'll run it again. Now this time if we do a get, since I changed the controller name, we need to say orders, change the verb to a get. You'll notice here we have a nice JSON formatted version of our orders. So this kind of illustrates how the framework deals with serialization. You can actually serialize the CLR object to JSON very easily by just changing the return type of your action on your API controller. One last thing I'd like to demonstrate here is something called content negotiation. As we develop services, content negotiation is pretty important. We have clients that can be pretty finicky about the type of data that they want to send to service, the type of data that they want to get back from a service. Out of the box, the web API gives us two types. It gives us JSON, which we've kind of seen, and it also gives us support for XML. Additionally, the framework gives us some extension points if you wanted to do something like use Atom Hub, RSS, or some form of custom media type. You could very easily plug in to that, do that as well. But I just want to briefly show how simple it is to basically change the type from JSON to XML. And it's really as simple as adding the accept header and application XML. Now if I run this, the framework is going to look at that. It's going to say, oh, this client wants XML. And it will return to me XML. So if I run this, notice that Fiddler has this other icon here, which is the XML icon. And if we look at the response here, it is actually XML. If you look at the raw data, you can kind of see that it's in the standard XML format. So that's really kind of how content negotiation works. If you had different media types, you would supply that type with the accept header, and you would build in things to the framework to handle those specific types. So I covered quite a bit in a short amount of time. We talked a little bit about how to create a very, very basic service. We looked at how we can call the service using an HTTP builder. We looked at some of the differences between MVC traditionally and the Web API, especially when it comes to how it's routed. And we even looked a little bit at content management. Now this is the content negotiation. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more out there that you can look at. So if you want to know more about this, you can come to MVC and hear my full presentation on September 15th, the shameless plug. Or you can go to the website. There's a lot of great videos out there that walk through all this stuff in much more depth. You can get a lot of great information. It's actually one of the most informative technology sites that Microsoft has put out on the frameworks. So with that, I want to turn the meeting back over to our Toastmaster.